Give it a minute. Good evening, everyone. I'm your host, Francesca Warren, and this is Doing the Work. And our first guest for this season is Advancing Equity, SEL, and Whole Child Systems with Brenda Ortiz McGrath. Now, Brenda, before we start, is Dr. Ortiz McGrath? I forgot to ask you that.
No, so my hope is that by August 15th, I will be able to defend my dissertation, and then it will be Dr. Ortiz McGrath.
I love it. Okay. So, guys, if you are listening right now, all over the world, we know we have people in Europe, we have people in Africa, we have people just all over the world listening to this. Before we start, put where you're from in the chat. Let us go from that. And before we get into this conversation about equity, SEL, and whole child systems, Brenda, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got into education, just all the things? It's your time to brag. So go ahead.
Yeah, so I've been in education for going on in 21 years. Started as a social worker by trade. So I am a social worker by trade, and began my journey in 2004 with the school-based, working within the public sector. And, I went from, doing school-based social work to, then exploring leadership opportunities. So I have been, I'm a district level leader now, pre-K through 12, overseeing social work, SEL, and specialized student supports. Previous to that was a high school principal, and have been, I've been in leadership for the past 11 years, really enjoying the work. District leadership, I miss the school-based work, but I absolutely love district leadership. I love the larger scale impact and being able to have a larger scale influence in the work that I do. So it's something that's, near and dear to my heart. I still, very much so practice the social work piece as well. One of the things I always say is that social workers make excellent school-based leaders. So I encourage our social workers out there to definitely explore leadership opportunities. And I'm also recently elected. So I am a local official. I am a school committee member. So this past November, I did win that election. And, I also speak at a national level. So I'm a consultant on the side for MTSS, SEL related work, and also have the opportunity to speak nationally, which has been really great. Most recent this past year, speaking at Urban Assembly, speaking at the Bright Consortium Conference, and really having the opportunity to connect with other educational leaders, but also just school-based staff who are looking for support around MTSS and SEL related work. So for me, it's work that I'm passionate about, very community involved. I'm also a new self-published author. So I have written a children's book. It is a bilingual children's book, and it's always been a passion of mine. So being able to now explore what it means to be an author, and be able to work on publishing my own material as well. So I would say, I'm a jack of all trades, but everything is all interconnected to education, and leads to always working towards improving student outcomes, but work that I'm really passionate about, and supporting the whole child really is at the core of the work that I do, whether I am an elected local official, whether I am, an author, or whether I'm school-based and district staff, always focusing on the entire whole child to be able to provide supports and resources.
I love that. So social worker, India, he's coming from Detroit. Some of my greatest friends are social workers, and what I appreciate the most about them is their care. They have a general care. And I think, like you said, it translates so well into education because that's at the heart of what we do. So I love it. Now, before we start, and as people are coming in, we know you guys are getting ready, coming home from work, getting ready. If you were like me, you were cooking dinner, making sure everybody had eaten before I got on here. But I want to give you, and we didn't do this last season, guys, but I want to do it this season. because I feel like it's a great way for us to, just from off the wall advice. We have people, hold on, I hear some feedback. I wonder if that's me. Maybe that's me. Maybe it's not. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read this question. Brenda, just tell us how you honestly how would you approach the situation? And then I'll give my thoughts and we'll go from there. A teacher
Sure.
emailed us and said, I have a folder for each class period where kids turn in physical work whenever they finish. I've been running into a problem where students say, I put it in the folder, but I don't have it. If they're telling the truth, I feel bad having them redo it. But at the same time, kids will lie and see if I give them credit anyway. How would you handle it? Brenda, what would you do?
So that could be a very complicated, definitely, a fun question. So I'm glad that it was asked, and definitely one that I think many teachers experience, right? So first, I would really, as a teacher, as a classroom teacher, I'd really look at, the student. Has the student in the past possibly shared that they either turned in an assignment, right? So I'd really look at kind of some of the historical context with that particular student. But I'd also, as a teacher, reflect on what is the structures and systems that you have within your classroom setting to ensure that students are turning in that work. So are they all turning it in at the same time? Or is it done in a less structured format? So that's something I would also consider. I think things that you want to consider is, is this a pattern? If it's not, what are the structures and systems that you have within your classroom? So you want to check your teacher side systems, make sure that you're checking in your turn-in tray, your folders, any desk, bins that you might have where there could be a misplacement. But also being able to potentially ask the student for, evidence of completion or submission, depending on the grade level, right? It can vary. If it's a high school student, you might be looking at a Google Classroom per se. But if it's, our younger grades, being able to ask them, concrete information. When did you turn it in? At what time did you turn it in? Do you remember what the assignment looked like? Just to get that sense. And then, I think there's ways and opportunities to give students grace. So if there's room and opportunity to give a missing or an incomplete until resolved, I would do so. You want to make sure that you're not being punitive with the student and coming across as accusatory. So being able to somewhat give a benefit of the doubt, right? Being able to kind of look at these, investigate somewhat, prior to making a final decision. Then, if it was misplaced by the teacher, then we don't penalize the student. But if there's no evidence of the assignment being turned in, then being able to give the student, opportunity to reproduce the assignment and turn it in. I think that's something that's really important, in making sure that you're providing students that space as well. But I do think there is, as simple as the question can be, it can be very complex because we know teachers are dealing with a significant number of students. Sometimes we're looking at classroom sizes of 30. So being able to create systems and structures that provide. So if you know that every student needs to turn in their assignments, at 9 a.m., for example, what systems and structures do you have in place? Do you call them up by row if they're sitting in rows? If they're sitting in cohorts, do you, call them up by the first cohort to go and turn in their assignments? And then I think that also helps the teacher visually see who's getting up, who's turning in the assignments at the same time, and is there a student sitting back, right? So I think there's many different ways of looking at it. I don't think there's any right or wrong answer per se. I think it's looking at the options that you have in front of you and then being able to work directly with that student and making sure that you're considering also the student's profile. Is this a student who has historically done this in the past? Is this a student who might have, right, if we're looking at supporting the whole child, is this a student who might have some external factors that are impacting that student that may prevent the student from turning in the assignment, and maybe the student's just embarrassed? So there's so many layers to it. And that's a big, that's a big response for a simple question, but I do think there's so many layers to it.
That's such a good answer, because that is, as I'm looking on all of our comments that people put on there, that's a lot of what teachers said, right? And I do agree, the grade level depends, like the way my seniors opposed to a third grader. And when you talk about the systems, it makes me think, I had these, back in the day, you have those things on your desk where it has like 6 rows and every class
Mm-hmm.
period in there. So I love it. And India says right here, give versatility for how homework is completed, i.e., bingo choice, etc. So they have a way to show understanding, even if it's not in the standard way. I agree. Like I used to teach English. What content did you teach, Brenda?
So I was a social worker by trade. So the curriculum that I pushed out was more social emotional. It wasn't
Yes.
necessarily a content area like math or ELA, for example.
Absolutely. And so, the standard way. So I do like that, because it helps, especially for kids, for understanding. So I think that's great. So thank you for answering that question. That wasn't too bad. Sometimes people get nervous. They're like, what are you going to ask? I'm like, no, it's going to be fun. So I really want to talk about MTSS. I want to talk about,
Mm-hmm.
what you look for. But for those who are watching, we have some new teachers. We have some teachers who have been out of the classroom for a while. When you walk into a district or a school, right? What are some of the first signs you look for in determining whether MTSS is truly working versus it just looks good on paper? Like, what do you look for? What should teachers know? Heck, what is MTSS for those who are listening and like, we don't use that terminology in our school?
Yeah.
Talk us a little bit through that.
Yeah, so the MTSS process is the multi-tiered support system. And you're looking at, 3 tiers, where there is the universal, right? 100% of our students are getting that tier 1 related practice, which I will say is the most difficult to implement. We are very reactive in nature. So we will respond to tier 2 and tier 3. Tier 3 is, targeted intervention, and then tier 2, sorry, and then tier 3 is intensive intervention. And at times we struggle with that. As districts, we are very reactive in nature. Something happens, we respond, we fix it, and then we hope for the best, and then it rehappens again. So when I look for strong MTSS related work and really strong tier 1, I think it's really important, and I want to start with this, that social emotional learning and MTSS has really lived in isolation. And it's really important that we marry it with the day-to-day curriculum and instruction, and making sure that it is embedded in our day-to-day practice, that it lives within our hallways, that it lives within our classrooms, but that it really lives within our culture and climate within our schools. So that's something that of the work that I currently do is really focused on making sure that we are embedding the SEL MTSS practice within our everyday, settings, from classroom to hallways to cafeteria, really any space. So for me, when I walk into a school, the first sign, whether people can, I always look at whether people can clearly explain how students are identified, how they're supported, how they're monitored, and how they're followed up with. And really, for me, MTSS is a shared process. It is shared ownership. It doesn't live only with support staff. It doesn't live only with administration. It doesn't live only with teachers. It is a collective effort. So for me, MTSS is not just a meeting. It's not just having a form, right? Sometimes, there are check boxes or a chart or a rubric, but it really is embedded in our day-to-day living system. So when MTSS is working, you see the shared ownership. Teachers are not carrying this weight alone. Administrators know what their students' needs are. They know their students, I always say, I'm a district administrator for Chelsea Public Schools, and we use the motto name, strength, and story. So making sure that our students and our administrators know our students by name, strength, and story, knowing that, who are the support staff that are supporting those students, but also knowing that support staff they're including support staff in the problem solving process, but also that we're including our families and helping build, capacity and skill set in supporting our families. things that I've done to strengthen MTSS is parent universities, parent workshops, and making them part of the process is something that's so critical. How are we leveraging data? Are we using our data? Because our data tells us a story, right? It shares a narrative. So are we utilizing our data to inform our practice? Those are pieces that I look at. Also for consistency and alignment, are interventions happening regularly, or is intervention happening sporadically? Are teams reviewing it within their spaces, right? Are they looking at early warning indicators? Are they working collectively during, their professional learning spaces and their student support team meeting times? Really looking at whether there's consistency in practice. And the other thing is, students shouldn't stay living within one tier. We shouldn't have a student at tier 2, and I'll use high school, for example. Tier 2 shouldn't live for 4 years. So are students fluctuating through tiers, and making sure that they're getting the supports that they need? And that for me is, that is part of a strong MTSS system. Prevention is critical. Are adults responding earlier and not waiting till students are in crisis and being reactive in nature? And for me, the biggest sign that MTSS is working is that students experience support before failure patterns begin or happen. So making sure that our students are feeling successful from the beginning and not waiting until a student is in crisis to then implement support services. I firmly believe that if we are preventative in nature, if we are providing all of our students with strong tier 1 universal practices, and all of our students have access to those supports, and it's built into our daily culture and climate, then we will, and sometimes it takes years. I know this work doesn't happen overnight, but if we do it continuously and we are with fidelity, we will see progress. And it will take some time, and we have to have patience. But I always say progress takes time and doesn't happen overnight.
I love that. And I think that you hit on such good points, because tier 1, and you recently wrote an article for the Educators Room about tier 1, but tier 1 is so important. So I've seen all these social media memes where they're talking about, oh, if you don't have tier 1, you don't have anything. How do schools get to a strong tier 1 system? Like, I see so many schools that think it's about a curriculum, or it's about how do you get to a strong tier 1 so that when you're talking about, advancing equity, when you're talking about SEL, when you're talking about just making sure kids don't stay in tier 2 for 3 years, how do you get to a strong tier 1?
Yeah, I mean, I think, in this conversation, coincidentally came up today within, the scope of my work, and we're working on, a portrait of a graduate, and I'm going to use that as an example. We need the foundation, right? We need to be able to identify what are the core values and what do we want. We need to recognize that we are educational institutions. What do we want our students to leave with? It starts at the top, right, with district messaging, and having that, that messaging from your district leaders. And if they are able to, message the importance of those core values, then it trickles down to the school-based administration, and then it trickles down to the staff. But there has to be an understanding in regards to what are our students' needs, what do we want to accomplish, what do we want our students to leave with when they leave, our institutions, and what are the core values, and making sure that we have strong culture and climate within our systems. Buy-in can be difficult, right? And there can be a level of resistance at times. However, we need to all be rowing in the same direction. So I always say strong foundation at the top, providing, what we want to accomplish, then having that level of buy-in, but then also making sure that staff feel equipped with the tools and resources and professional development that they need to feel like they can implement effective tier one practice within their classroom settings. And I'll use an example of, high school example. I was a high school principal. So, I used to tell my staff, you know, we're gonna do two things, and we're gonna learn two things really well this year. At passing time, my expectation is that everyone is out in the hallways greeting students. That to me is part of creating a welcoming environment. That to me is a component of SEL. So making sure that as students are transitioning from class to class, they're out in the hallway greeting students, whether you're shaking hands, saying hello, high fives. To me, that is improving culture and climate. That is part of our tier one universal practice. Making sure that our students, for example, have access to support staff. What does that look like? Do we have a tier one referral process for our students to be able to access staff when they need it? Making sure that we are, providing, and you said it nicely in regards, it was very well said in regards to that it can't live separate. And at times there's an understanding that, SEL or, tier one supports, might live in an advisory period that doesn't improve the school-wide culture and climate. So I would say definitely at the top, the messaging is important, having a clear vision, having a clear mission, making sure that your staff understands the vision and mission as well, but also that the staff has the support that they need to be able to implement and achieve. For example, if we had a portrait of a graduate, what does that look like? That should be the drive of our everyday work, right? If we know we want our students to leave with critical thinking skills, what does that look like? And providing the tools and resources to be able to support our staff to then be able to provide that level of support for our students. So it really is, starts at the top for sure.
So don't mind my dog in the background, guys. I have a big old dog, and he's a squirrel, so it's always interesting. So I'm going to try to get through this question because it's interesting that you talked about Obi. My dog is going crazy. We're going to pause for a second because everybody loves dogs. There's nothing you can do. Okay. He's such a baby. So you've talked a lot about MTSS and tier one and all those things. And I love how you talk about it being a system, right? Because there are people who are going to be watching this who are going to say, oh my God, I'm trying to do it at my school, but we have so much going on. We're coming to school with so many kids who have so many needs. I'm struggling. So I want to talk a little bit about SEL, right? It's a core of student success, but what does it look like in practice daily? And I want to bring this up to the ranks because we have some places in the country where SEL is a dirty word. And some places where they're embracing it. But I think we can all agree that kids after COVID, post-COVID, have come in with so many needs, something is needed. So can you talk a little bit like what does that look like when it's fully embedded? What's your experience has been? All of those things.
Yeah. So, I want to start with, the states where, yes, SEL is, I was visiting a state not too long ago when I was doing school site visits, and, I used the word SEL, and they were like, we don't use SEL here. We use belonging, right? So there is creativity to rename what SEL. We don't necessarily need to call it social emotional learning. We know there is, belonging is a perfect word as well. So I think right now in the work that I currently do, so I spearhead the district SEL initiative. So I work with district leaders. I work with SEL related leads who are, for the most part, classroom teachers. So this is an addition for them, and working with them to help embed strong SEL within their classroom spaces. So for me, when SEL is fully embedded, it does not feel like one extra lesson, right, on a Friday afternoon. We don't want teachers to feel the burden. We know that staff is already inundated. We know that behaviors, social emotional wellness, mental health, you know, attendance, it's just we know that it is at the forefront right now. Our students are struggling. And it's not just, and there's a pattern across many districts, right? It's not just one particular district. This is a national crisis that we're seeing, especially around mental health related concerns. So for me, it shows up um, in a classroom. It shows up in a way that's structured, but it also shows up in how adults respond to behavior, how students talk to one another, how teachers are building a sense of belonging. So I love to use examples. So when I was a principal, and curriculum instruction is extremely important. But relationships, if we don't build strong relationships, we know that performance, there's going to be underperformance. So I would always tell my teachers, I'd say, we're going to pause for the first month. We're going to still do our curriculum because we have to, and our instruction, but we're really going to focus on building relationships the first month. Get to know your students, get to know their wants, their needs, their goals, their dreams. And I would provide them with, lessons within their classrooms, and teacher talking points to allow them to do this. So I was able to create those activities. But for me, and I had used this example before, it's as simple as, greeting students by their name, creating predictable routines, teaching students how to work through conflict, building reflection into lessons. And I always tell, our staff this when I give examples. You could be in a math lesson and you might be doing, some problem solving. Ask those students, how does this problem make you feel? Does it make you feel anxious? Does it make you feel frustrated? Does it make you feel excited? That is part of the SEL work, allowing students to recognize their emotions within those spaces. Helping students understand themselves as learners, I think, is huge. It also looks like we also need to take care of adult SEL. So making sure that our adults in the space feel comfortable in modeling the same skill sets when asking students to develop. Sometimes we expect staff to perform, right? And we say, you're going to do SEL. But we also need to take care of our staff's SEL and help them with modeling and what that looks like, especially for our younger and newer educators who might be coming into this space, making sure that we're modeling as seasoned educators in terms of what this looks like. And I mentioned this before as well, SEL cannot live separate from academics. And I think that is one of the challenges that historically has existed. We've seen, daily SEL, mental health related supports, as separate and living in isolation, and being able to embed that into our day-to-day practice. And some of our staff are doing it really well. They just don't know how to identify it and name it. So being able to provide them with that PD to allow them to see that their practice is already SEL, and now they're able to name it and identify it. So there's definitely room, an opportunity to be able to do those things. But I do think that it's important, especially for students who feel disconnected, for students who are dysregulated, or, are feeling unseen or having a harder time accessing instruction, to be able to embed some of these practices, getting to know your students, getting to understand their wants, their needs, their goals, really helps strengthen the relationship, but also helps, strengthen SEL within your classroom, but also, strengthens the conditions for learning. And there are a lot of demands, as you named it. And I think that there's so much happening on the day-to-day that we are forgetting, what, and I bring myself back. I'm 45, and I bring myself back to when I was learning. What brought me joy as a student? What brought me joy as a learner? And, being able to ground myself in that is really important. And I always tell, our educators is, ground yourself within your own core values of what brings you joy, what brought you joy as a learner, and embed some of those practices in your space. Because I do think that relationships really is at the forefront. We will see students stay engaged. We will see, we will see students, we will see their performance improve if we're able to embed those strong practices within the classroom.
I had to come off mute. We're 6 years post COVID. I still have trouble coming off mute. I think that's so important because you talked about dysregulated kids, and there are so many dysregulated adults. And it's interesting that you talk about that because as a learner, I learned best when I knew that my teacher cared about me and I belonged in that classroom. And it wasn't because they were like jumping through hoops or it was how they managed the classroom. It's how they brought everybody along. It's, those things. And so it for me personally, it always infuriates me when people are like, we don't need SEL, we don't need belonging, or we don't need inclusive. I'm like, no, everybody needs to feel like that because,
Absolutely.
everybody. So it just makes me think about that in that way. We have a couple of comments. India. Hey, India, she is our super team today. What would be some school-wide initiatives that could be in place to make this happen? Love that. Yes, India, ask.
Yeah, absolutely love that question, India. Thank you so much. And I think you can look at it in different, many different aspects. So currently right now, just to kind of give you the example, I do oversee the SEL district initiative. I am in a smaller district. We have a little bit under 6,000 students and we have 11 schools. I have been, blessed to be able to have the funding available to be able to provide the additional supports that are needed. So I have an SEL lead in every school. Not only do I have an SEL lead in every school, but they have a core team of 4 to 5 people in addition to build their school-based SEL team. And then we work with SEL designated administrators who are typically an AP, sometimes a principal, and they join us. And we've been able to do this work collectively as a district. And this year, one of the things that we've embedded as a practice with our district SEL leadership team is every other month we meet within developmental cohorts, which has been huge. So being able to share best practices. So I have the secondary team meeting together and then the pre-K elementary team meeting together. So that's been huge. Things that I've embedded within the district, as a former high school principal, my instructional leadership team was multidisciplinary. I had the librarian was part of my instructional leadership team. I had school counselors, social workers. And the reason why I didn't only include classroom teachers was because of the whole child perspective, because I wanted teachers to feel equipped with the tools and resources and strategies and interventions that they could implement within their classroom setting. So, one of the examples that came out of the instructional leadership team practice that we did was, we provided teachers with a template of a strong classroom management plan to support within their classroom. And it wasn't an obligation to use, it wasn't mandatory, but it was a tool, right? Allowing teachers to model, but also allowing teachers to observe their peers in practice. So those SEL walkthroughs is huge. Things that I've done for staff within the last couple of years was, I've provided our staff with mental health first aid, and our teachers have been able to receive training around mental health first aid training. So they're now able to identify the signs. They're now able to support students, not as a clinician, right? Because we know that's an expertise, but to support them at the tier one, the tier one level. Making sure that we are embedding spaces within our classrooms where students who are, if they're dysregulated or need a break, that you create that structure that doesn't disrupt your class. They can now get up and walk to, that little corner, that little nook with some sensory items And then when they're regulated, they can come back to their desk, right? Making sure that you're embedding some of those practices within your space, but it does provide guidance. And, you do need that level of guidance and support. Some of the other things that I've done as full district PD is tier 1 curriculum PD. So I've used Trails for Wellness, for example, and teachers have been able to embed that as part of their community meeting, as part of student journaling, and they're able to embed some of those practices. So again, making sure that teachers feel equipped but have the tools and resources that they need to be able to fully embed some of that practice.
I love that. And I think, India said, I truly believe bringing back these school-wide initiatives to make learning enjoyable, including families, what not could be the push, but what are some of the practices, ways to make that happen in a school. So India's really thinking about, I can see the wheels turning in her head.
Mhm.
It's like, what are some practical ways for us to do that tomorrow or the next day, or as you're planning for next year, what does that look like?
Yeah. And it doesn't cost money, right? I think we know districts are hurting right now. And we know that we are in a budget crisis when it comes to how we're sustaining. So, I try to do things that are very low cost or don't cost any money at all, and making sure that, you're utilizing those resources. One of the things that I'd love to share with all of you is, so I'm huge on family engagement. And making sure that we're engaging our families. I developed a platform called Core Kind 360. It's Core Kind 360 Families. It's accessible on the internet, and it's a platform for educators, but also for families. And it provides with practical tools and resources that you could utilize to support social emotional wellness within your classrooms. So definitely, I encourage folks to check it out. To me, it's a free platform. And my hope is that there is providing more access is kind of my overall goal in making sure that people don't have to pay a significant amount of money to access these resources.
I love that you said it doesn't cost any money. Because I think that right now it's people's biggest, like, oh my God, it's going to cost. We got to do. No, you talked about practical things. India also says it definitely takes more than just a classroom teacher. We depend on everyone with an ability to ensure the learning is effective, but other school-wide practice support the learning climate. I love that. I think that's so let's talk a little bit about strengthening equity, right? Equity is at the core to your work. It is what you do. How do you move school leaders from talking about equity to actually building systems around it? People are going to watch this and say, in my state, we can't even say equity. What are some things that they can do? Because equity is also about students with disabilities. It's about English language learners. It is a whole gamut. So what are some of these things?
Yeah, so I think the first step in helping leaders, move equity from a value statement, into our daily practice. I think I wouldn't, I think many districts, right, and I'd like to believe all districts are going to say that equity matters, right? And I know that, again, the word equity can seem somewhat of a dirty word in certain areas, right? Whether you're calling it belonging, however you want to name it, I think people have gotten really creative. But I think, the real question is, where does it show up, right? In schedule, staffing, access, curriculum, interventions, language support, special education services, in family communication, and I think, I'm going to use for the example, our multilingual learners and our students with disabilities. I think it's important to recognize that, equity means that we cannot confuse access with placement, right? And I think that's important. We have to ask whether students are receiving high quality instruction, appropriate supports, and meaningful opportunities to participate fully in the school community. I push leaders to look at these patterns. Who is being referred? Who is being suspended, right? Are we looking at our disproportionality data? Who is chronically absent. And I don't like the word chronically absent. I use presence gap personally. You know, who has access to advanced coursework, enrichment, mental health supports, and strong tier one instruction? So for me, you know, the equity work becomes real when we stop blaming students and families, and really start examining the systems around them, right? And that, you know, at times can require courage, right? And I'm having these conversations all the time with my support staff, because we're, you know, we do challenge and we do question, you know, but I also think it requires those practical leadership moves. So for me, you know, making sure that our practice is strong within, right? And that we are, you know, considering, when we're looking at equity, we know that we need to meet students where they're at and give them what they, and we know that looks differently for every student, right? And that can be complicated work. But I do think that it's important for us to always stay grounded in our internal practices and where we can improve, right? Are we leveraging, and I mentioned this earlier, are we leveraging our data to inform our practice? We know our data tells us a story. What does that look like? Are we, you know, if we want to support students within an MTSS model and we're looking at tier 1, 2, and 3, you have to consider the whole child. You have to consider every factor that influences and impacts this child's life. And, you know, and that can be very complicated to do. So always making sure that we are just, you know, pushing for tight systems and structures within that allow us to continue to inform and support the equity work that needs to happen.
I appreciate that. And I feel like that is common, that it helps teachers who are literally in states where they can be definitely disciplined, for even saying the word equity. So I really appreciate that. I want to talk a little bit about family engagement. Actually, I want to talk a lot about family engagement because I feel like you just said something that was so poignant. You said we stop blaming families, right? And sometimes in schools, it can feel very surface level for us to engage families. Oh, we had this event. Oh, you didn't come. You don't want to be engaged. But what are some ways that you think that schools can deepen and have really partnerships with families?
Yeah, so I think, you know, I use some examples, and family engagement is as simple as it can sound. It's probably one of the most complex, right? And I think it is an area that many districts struggle in. You know, I think of back to school night, and we're like, where are our families, right? And how do we engage our families? So I do think we need to recognize that there, you know, and I've always worked in urban districts. So I always look at the demographics and the population that I'm serving. What are their needs, right? Because their needs look very different from an urban setting to a suburban setting or a rural setting. And how do we engage our families? So making sure that we're creating a welcoming space for them as well. Making sure that there's language accessibility is huge. Are we only relying? I tell my staff this all the time, right? Family engagement is not, family engagement is two-way engagement. It's not, I sent an email, I engaged the family, they never responded back, right? And it's making sure that we're reaching them in many different ways. So what does that look like? Whether it is, you know, through a platform such as Parent Square, whether it's through newsletters, whether it's through the Parent University. When I implemented the Parent University, I did it via Zoom. Why? Because I knew that my families were going to connect, and we did it in person and via Zoom. So that accessibility is huge, right? And recognizing that there's so many demands for our families as well, especially with the way, you know, the economy is today. Many of our families are working more than one job. So giving them some grace as well to be able to meet them, making sure that we're building those partnerships, creating spaces. As a principal, I did a parent coffee hour, and I had parents in person, and they would also come via Zoom to connect. So they weren't missing any information. They were able to engage, and making sure that they have access to that. Also providing them with opportunities for learning. and building capacity, right? Helping them build those skill sets. Most recently, I presented for our families. It was around mental health related supports and supporting your learners at home and taking care of their own mental health needs. A 1 hour conversation turned into 3 hours of a presentation because my families were so engaged. So making sure that you're creating platform and spaces for them to celebrate their students, celebrate themselves as family, but also be a part of the school community, whether it's through school site councils, whether it's through, parent teacher conferences. But just like we want to meet our students where they're at, we also need to meet our families where they're at. I'm very involved and embedded in community-based work. So sometimes I got to go to my families if they're not coming to me. And those are things that, I do with the support staff. But it is something that we have to really think outside the box. That brick and mortar mindset and expectation really is, historically, we know that family engagement has always been difficult. So now we have to get very creative and look for those pathways to do so, but work also collectively with your families. We survey our families every year, and we survey them on equity and wellness and SEL, and we ask our families what they want, what they need, and how we can better support them, and if they feel like they have a strong partnership with us.
I love that, the listening to students, teachers, parents, like I love that piece because that gives you valuable data that you probably wouldn't get other places. Now we have 15 minutes left and I have a surprise question at the end. So I'm going to get 2 more questions out of you.
Okay.
Are you okay for 2 more questions?
Sure.
Okay, so let's talk student voice. We have seen in the last probably 8 years, I feel like students have become even more active in their voice and what they want, what they don't want. We discuss it a lot, but I don't know if it's necessarily prioritized. So what are some practical ways that schools can, genuinely center student voice in decision making while still maintaining safety and, tier 1 instruction?
Yeah, so I think, centering student voice, for me means asking students about their experiences and then showing them that their feedback matters, right? I think and this tends to happen at times where we might ask for feedback, we might do a survey, and then we don't know what happens with the responses, right? And I think, for me, that can happen, right? But I do think I appreciate the face-to-face contact, right? So I think ways that can happen is through student advisory groups, the surveys, listening sessions, allowing students to participate in a school improvement planning process, allowing students to be part of our culture and climate teams so that they can build a sense of belonging and be a part of the engagement efforts. But I think for me, the most important part is, right, we can create all those spaces, is follow through, right? If students share that they do not feel connected, safe, represented, or heard, adults need to come back and say, here's what I heard, and here's what we're doing about it. And this is how we're going to change it, right? It shouldn't be, student voice shouldn't just be symbolic. They're the ones receiving, and, they're the ones that experience our system every day. So if we're making decisions about belonging, mental health, discipline, instruction, in school culture without them, then we're missing that level of critical information.
Oh, I love that. I think that's so critical. Now, before our last question, we have educators who are watching, who will watch the replay, who will watch it on social media in the morning or late tonight, who really are committed to doing the work. And one of the reasons, I didn't say this at the beginning, guys, but Brenda is one of our top 50 educators. And so she is doing the work. And sometimes there's resistance to that. How have you stayed focused and to push systems forward and not be stagnant and saying, it's not the time, I might get in trouble? How have you stayed the course?
Yeah, so staying grounded in my why is huge. And then, focusing and, remembering really who the work is for, right? Who are we working for? Systems change is hard and resistance is real. right? In all different levels, whether you are administration, teaching staff, you see resistance across the board. But when you stay grounded in students, families, and the outcomes you're trying to improve, it gives you the courage to keep going and pushing. I
Mm,
always tell folks, ground yourself in your why, what led you to this work and why you're here.
yeah.
Um, I don't take all resistance personally. I know it's not about me, right? I think sometimes resistance comes from lived experience and professional experience. Sometimes resistance also gives us information. As a leader, if my staff is resisting, or if families are resisting, or students, that's information for me to take and really question, why are they resisting?
Yeah.
Um, it can reveal fear, confusion, fatigue, lack of trust. You know, as leaders, we have to be comfortable with listening and making sure that we're listening,
Mm,
but we're also hearing the concerns and
yeah.
then providing clarity and clarification and then making adjustments, right? There's no perfect system, but we can absolutely work towards improvement.
Mm,
And we cannot abandon important work just because it's uncomfortable. So for me, I try to really stay focused on building those coalitions, celebrating the small wins, using data to show progress, but also keeping the message consistent. Um, so doing the work, I always say, requires both urgency and patience. You have to push, but you also have to bring people with you. And that balance is where for me, where real leadership lives. When you can bring your staff with you in that messaging.
mm, absolutely. Thank you for that. The last question, and this is kind of, I think this is a good one. People always answer this differently. So tomorrow you wake up and you are the Department of Education secretary. What is your platform? What is going to be one of some of the first things that you do to bring solutions to some of the issues we see in education?
So definitely, I would say a tough question, because there's a lot of things I'd want to focus on. But I think for me, if I'm looking at where we are at right now in society and the challenges, mental health is really at the forefront. Our young people are struggling. We are looking at, that presence gap, right? That chronic absenteeism. We're looking at, our urban districts are struggling with dropout rate. So for me, I'd really, if I could implement anything, um, if I was, this leader that had that level of sphere and influence, I'd really want us to ground ourselves on trying to build those relationships first, right? Providing resources and tools and funding to allow our schools to improve our culture and climate, so that we have the tools that we need to be able to support our staff with professional development, access, um, and making sure that we are putting the equity work at the forefront. Because I do think, right, and I don't know if there's many ways I could answer this, but my desire and my vision, if I could, if I could make changes at that level, would be really strong culture and climate within our schools where all of our students feel welcomed, safe, engaged, and where our staff feel like they can walk into their buildings welcomed, safe, and engaged as well. And right. And I think, for me, that's really important. And again, I don't know if there's a simple answer to this, but I would love to see monies coming in to support districts with this work. And I think that funding is an issue. I think that we are trying to think outside the box, but I do think there's panic around funding. And how do we continue to bring in the tools and resources that are needed for our kids to successfully thrive? And I think that's going to be a continuous challenge for us in the upcoming years.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that. And I always love to hear people's different takes on what they would do. Is there anything that we did not cover tonight that you're like, I got to say this? I need to say this. I need to say it now. Did anything that you want to say?
No, I mean, I think I love the discussion. It's such an honor to be in this space with all of you today. But no, I think we've covered a whole lot, and I know it was a big discussion, and it's an ongoing discussion. So definitely encourage folks. I'm on LinkedIn, happy to always chat with folks. You can find me under Brenda Ortiz McGrath to connect. I'd love to be able to connect with educators at a national level. I am a Castle Fellow, so I'm finishing my fellowship with Castle and continuing that strong SEL work. But work that I'm really passionate about. From being a school-based social worker to being a dean, to then being a principal, to then being a district level leader, and now an elected local official who also supports that district level work as a school committee member. Just really passionate about the work that I do, and it all leads to always improving student outcomes and providing access.
Absolutely. We are so appreciative of your time. Guys, there's a couple of things when we send this out to our newsletter. We will not only publish Brenda's article, it's already been published, but what we'll also do is her profile in our top 50 educator magazine. So everybody will see that. But Brenda, thank you for joining us. We appreciate you. Guys, it is 7:55. I'm giving you back 5 minutes of your time, and join us this Sunday for our Education News podcast, where we dive deep into all education topics. But also join us next Wednesday as we bring on our next guest. Registration will open this weekend. Get in. Thank you. And Brenda, we'll tag you on LinkedIn for you to share with your followers. We're excited about the work that you do, and you should be very proud of all the things you've accomplished.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure.
Absolutely. Have a good night, guys.
Have a good night.